Hey, you. Ever feel like you want to get your head around something really complex, but you just don't have weeks to read everything?
Yeah, wading through endless articles isn't always practical.
Exactly. So that's what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into atheism. Think of it as a shortcut to the core ideas, the main
We've
arguments.
done the sifting for you, basically. Trying to pull out the essential insights on why someone might not believe in God. You don't need a philosophy degree for this.
So first things first, what is atheism? Simply put, it's lacking belief in God or any divine beings.
Right. The absence of that belief.
And here's a number that might, surprise some people. Estimates suggest there could be up to 1 billion atheists worldwide.
1 billion.
Right.
That's a lot. Though it's tricky getting precise numbers.
Yeah, super tricky. Social stigma, political pressure in some places. It makes accurate counting really difficult.
Absolutely. But the core principle for many atheists, as our source highlights, is that, well, the most reasonable conclusions are the ones with the best evidence supporting them.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack the why. What are the reasons, the arguments behind atheism? We've looked at sources discussing, the traditional arguments for God's existence, but also, crucially, the arguments against it.
We'll be digging into the main categories. Arguments claiming God doesn't exist, some based on logic, others on looking at the world around us.
And we'll also get into the epistemology, right? How atheists approach knowledge and belief itself.
Exactly, how they handle evidence, justification, that sort of thing. So yeah, buckle up for a quick but thorough look.
Great. So let's start by nailing down what we mean by God in this conversation. Our sources usually focus on the God of the big monotheistic traditions.
Yeah, typically Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being, capital G, God.
And then God's little g covers everything else.
Right, other divine figures, maybe with fewer powers, different characteristics, your Zeuses, your Thors, etc.
Okay. Now, one really key distinction the source makes is between different types of atheism. There's positive and negative atheism.
Exactly. That's crucial. Positive atheism is making the active claim God does not exist. It's an assertion.
Whereas negative atheism is.
It's simply not having the belief that God or gods exist. It's the lack of belief.
The source used some helpful analogies like amoral versus immoral.
Yeah, or atypical versus abnormal, asymmetrical. A meaning without. So atheism as without theism, not necessarily anti-theism.
Right, it's the absence, not necessarily opposition.
Precisely. And negative atheism is a broad category. It could include someone who's never really thought about it.
Or someone who has thought about it, maybe deeply, but just doesn't find the evidence convincing.
Or even thinks the whole question is unanswerable. It's important not to mix this up with agnosticism, though.
Ah, good point. Agnosticism is more about not knowing or feeling unable to know, right? Neither believing nor disbelieving.
Generally, yes. While negative atheism is simply the state of not believing.
And the scope can vary too. Restricted versus broad atheism.
Right. Restricted atheism is specifically about not believing in that single monotheistic capital G God.
But you could still believe in other supernatural stuff.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Someone could be a restricted atheist but still believe in ghosts or karma or some other non-physical force. It doesn't automatically mean they're a materialist or naturalist.
Okay, that's an important clarification. It counters that idea that all atheists think only physical stuff exists.
Definitely. Broad atheism, on the other hand, is disbelief in all gods across the board. No Zeus, no God, no supernatural deities at all.
Got it. So we have a clearer definition. Now let's dig into the epistemology, how atheists approach belief and justification. The source talks about an evidentialist approach. What's that mean?
In simple terms, it means your justification for believing or not believing something depends on the evidence you have for it.
And evidence here is broad, not just lab coats and test tubes.
Exactly. It includes logical arguments, like a priori reasoning, arguments trying to find the best explanation for why things are the way they are, inductive reasons based on observation, empirical data, even deductive arguments based on concepts.
And there's a kind of asymmetry here compared to how belief is sometimes justified in theism.
Well, yes, atheists typically don't cite faith as their reason for disbelief. They ground their position in a lack of evidence or in arguments against existence. Faith doesn't usually come into their justification for not believing.
But it's not like all theists rely only on faith either, right?
Absolutely not. The source is clear on that. You have evidentialist theists who believe there is good evidence for God. They might share the same basic principles about how evidence works as an evidentialist atheist.
They just disagree strongly on the evidence itself. or how to interpret it.
Precisely. Like the fine-tuning argument. A theist might see it as strong evidence for a designer. An atheist might see it as explainable by natural processes, or maybe the multiverse, or argue the tuning isn't even that fine. Same potential evidence, wildly different conclusions.
So what about those who do rely more on faith or argue evidence isn't the right yardstick for religious belief?
That's where you get into non-evidentialist theism. They might argue faith is a separate way of knowing, or that belief is justified for practical reasons, like Pascal's wager, or that it's properly basic, needing no argument.
And that leads to a more fundamental disagreement.
Potentially, yeah. It becomes a clash not just over specific arguments, but over the very role of evidence, reason, and faith in forming beliefs. A meta-epistemological disagreement, you might say.
The source also suggested that arguments against atheism that lean heavily on faith might lack a certain force.
Well, the idea in evidentialism is that good evidence gives you a reason and intellectual obligation, almost to believe. If you ignore strong evidence, you're being irrational. But faith, often defined as belief without or even against evidence, doesn't carry that same kind of rational weight in an argument. Simply lacking faith in a claim isn't usually seen as being intellectually irresponsible in the same way as denying clear evidence is.
So justifying atheism isn't just about debating specific proofs for God. It's also tied up in these bigger questions about how we should form beliefs in general.
Exactly. Many atheists see themselves as defending not just their specific stance on God, but the broader importance of science, reason, and evidence-based thinking across the board.
Now, the source mentioned friendly atheism from William Rowe. What's that about? It sounds amicable.
It is, relatively speaking. Rowe's idea is that an atheist, even one convinced God doesn't exist, can still acknowledge that a theist might be justified or rational in their belief, given their own evidence, experiences, and reasoning processes.
Even if the atheist thinks that belief is ultimately false.
Yes. Justification depends on the information someone has and how they reason from it. And that information or reasoning might be flawed, but the belief could still be reasonably held by that person.
Like the examples given. Ptolemy and the Earth-centered universe.
Right. Based on the evidence available to him, Ptolemy's belief was justified, even though we now know it's wrong. Or a medieval doctor using the best, albeit flawed, medical knowledge of their time. Their actions were justified based on what they knew.
So a friendly atheist accepts that a theist might have perfectly reasonable grounds for belief from their perspective.
Exactly. Maybe they have different background information. Maybe they trust a premise the atheist rejects. Maybe they weigh evidence differently. But from their epistemic position, belief might be rational. Of course, this cuts both ways. A friendly theist should also consider the atheist's grounds.
Contrasted with hostile atheism, which would just say any belief in God is irrational.
Right, and Rowe argues the friendly view is more constructive, recognizing the complexities involved.
Okay, then there's Antony Flew and the presumption of atheism. How does that work?
Flew argued that the default rational position, before considering any evidence, should be neutrality. And for Flew, neutrality lacking belief is negative atheism.
Like the presumption of innocence in court.
Perfect analogy. The burden of proof, Flew said, lies with the person making the positive claim in this case, the theist asserting God exists. The atheist doesn't have to prove God doesn't exist initially. They just start from a position of non-belief until convinced otherwise.
So it's atheism by default, but open to evidence.
Exactly. It's a starting point, not necessarily the end point. If compelling evidence for God emerges, the presumption is overturned.
How does that square with ideas about religious tolerance, where maybe belief without strong evidence is seen as okay?
Well, they conflict, really. Some interpretations of tolerance or religious freedom suggest it's epistemically permissible, maybe even virtuous, to believe in God without needing standard evidence, or even despite counter-evidence. Thinkers like Plantinga with Reformed epistemology or fideists lean this way.
But atheists push back on that idea.
Often, yes. They'll use analogies. We don't think it's rational to believe in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy just because you can't disprove them. We generally expect reasons for belief.
Right, like W.K. Clifford's idea about the ethics of belief, that it's wrong to believe anything without sufficient evidence.
Exactly. So there's a tension between Flew's demand for justification and a more permissive attitude towards religious belief.
Okay, that covers the foundations. Now let's move into the arguments against God's existence, starting with deductive atheology. What's the core idea here?
Deductive arguments try to show that the very concept of God, as traditionally defined, contains logical contradictions.
Like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that just can't exist because the definition itself is incoherent.
Precisely. If some or all of God's essential properties, omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, etc., are logically incompatible, then such a being is impossible.
And if these arguments work, they're very powerful.
Extremely powerful. They'd provide the strongest possible justification for positive atheism regarding that specific conception of God. It wouldn't just be unlikely, it would be logically impossible.
How might atheists respond to this kind of challenge?
The source mentions a couple of main ways. One is to revise the description of God to remove the contradiction.
Okay, but that seems tricky.
It faces several problems. First, if the traditional concept is incoherent, what's the basis for belief in this new revised version? Was that really what the person believed all along?
Yeah.
Second, is this revised, perhaps less powerful being still worthy of the title God or of worship? Third, what's the evidence for this new conception? Fourth, arguing for just another limited being doesn't seem very philosophically significant. And fifth, doesn't revising the definition basically concede that positive atheism about the original concept of God was correct?
It sounds like shifting the goalposts, maybe.
Right.
What's the other main response?
Claiming God is fundamentally beyond human comprehension. Thinkers like Kierkegaard or Tillich argued our concepts and language just can't capture God adequately.
So any apparent contradictions are just limits of our understanding, not problems with God.
That's the idea. But atheists often find this unsatisfying. If God is so incomprehensible that we can't even form a coherent idea, how can we have any reason to believe? As Patrick Grimm pointed out, if the concept is too vague to be refuted, it's also too vague to really believe in. What does the belief even mean at that point?
It becomes hard to grasp.
Very. Though deductive atheists do need to acknowledge that our concepts evolve.
Let's look at specifics. Single property refutations. The paradox of the stone is a classic example challenging omnipotence, right?
Absolutely. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy it cannot lift it? If no, it can't create the stone, then power. If yes, it can't lift the stone, then it's power. Either way, omnipotence seems challenged.
Leading to attempts to redefine omnipotence.
Exactly. Like saying omnipotence means ability to do anything logically possible, not the ability to violate logic itself. The source also mentions similar challenges to omniscience knowing everything.
Like, can God know indexical facts? I am here now. Or future free choices? Or are there mathematical limits, like with Cantor's or Gödel's theorems, that might apply even to divine knowledge?
Right. These are deep philosophical waters, often leading to specialized discussions, as the source notes. But the point is, these core attributes aren't logically simple.
And it's not just omnipotence and omniscience. Other attributes are challenged too.
Yes, the source mentions challenges to the coherence of eternity, personhood, perfect goodness being the ultimate cause. Pretty much the whole package has been questioned deductively.
Then there are multiple property refutations arguing that pairs of attributes clash.
Correct. Things like, how can God be both transcendent, beyond the world, and personal, interacting within it? How can God be perfectly just and perfectly merciful, unchanging and all-knowing, since knowledge changes as the world changes, omnipresent and a conscious agent?
The source highlights the tension between omnipotence and omniscience specifically.
Yes. If God knows everything, including his own future actions, does that limit his power to do otherwise? Does perfect foreknowledge restrict perfect freedom, even for God? Rowe also argued God couldn't be both perfectly good and perfectly free.
Lastly, under deductive arguments, failure of proof refutations. How does that work?
This argues that the very failure of arguments for God's existence provides evidence against God's existence.
Because you'd expect proof if God existed.
Kind of. J.M. Finley's version is key here. He argued that for God to be truly worthy of worship, God's existence couldn't just be accidental. It would have to be necessary, a necessary truth.
Okay.
And if God's existence were a necessary truth, we'd expect to be able to prove it through pure reason, like an ontological argument. Since ontological arguments and other proofs are widely seen as failures by philosophers.
Precisely. The lack of the expected proof becomes an argument for non-existence. Right. Okay, shifting gears now to inductive atheology. This starts by tackling that common phrase, you can't prove a negative.
Yeah, atheists hear this all the time. The objection is you can never be 100% certain God doesn't exist because new evidence might turn up. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, they say.
But the source argues this sets the bar too high.
Way too high. If we demanded absolute deductive proof for every negative belief, we couldn't reasonably believe anything doesn't exist.
Like, we believe dodos are extinct, or unicorns aren't real.
Or Russell's teapot isn't orbiting the sun, or Santa Claus isn't coming down the chimney. We don't have absolute proof none of these exist, but we're entirely justified in believing they don't, based on the overwhelming lack of evidence and our understanding of the world.
Applying that standard only to God seems inconsistent.
Exactly. Mackey pointed out that demanding that level of certainty leads straight to radical skepticism about almost everything.
The gravity elves analogy was good.
Yeah. We can't prove invisible elves aren't causing gravity, but it would be absurd to believe in them or even be agnostic about them just because we lack absolute disproof. Positive atheism about gravity elves is perfectly rational.
So inductive atheism relies on principles we use all the time for forming reasonable beliefs about non-existence.
Correct. It's about justification based on available evidence and expected evidence. Graham Offey's work, mentioned in the source, pushes for clearer thinking about what makes any stance, theist, atheist, agnostic, reasonable.
Michael Martin's general principle for justified disbelief in something X seems relevant here. What were those conditions again?
Roughly. 1. Evidence for X is weak or absent. 2. We'd expect evidence if X existed. 3. We've looked for that evidence and haven't found it. 4. We've looked in the right places. 5. There are no overriding reasons like pragmatic benefits to believe anyway.
And much of the atheistic literature tries to show these conditions are met for God.
That's the idea. Critiques of theistic arguments address condition 1. Debates about divine hiddenness address conditions 2, 3, and 4. Arguments against Pascal's wager address condition 5.
The key sticking points seem to be conditions 2 and 3. Would we expect evidence for God, and have we really looked properly?
Absolutely central. How would God manifest? Is God the kind of being that would leave discernible traces? Atheists like Martin argue yes, a being with God's purported attributes likely would, and that despite extensive search, philosophical, scientific, personal, such evidence hasn't been found. Martin concludes this justifies positive atheism.
Okay, specific inductive arguments. First up, a big one. The problem of evil.
Hugely significant. The sheer amount and types of suffering in the world, human and animal, seem hard to reconcile with an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good creator.
It comes in deductive and inductive forms.
Yes. The logical problem asks if any evil is compatible with God. The evidential problem argues that even if some evil is compatible, the extent and nature of the evil we see makes God's existence highly improbable. As noted, there are deeper dives into this specific topic.
Next, cosmology, the universe's origin and structure.
The source lays out 4 main views: naturalism, Big Bang, evolution, all natural processes; Big Bang theism, God started the Big Bang; intelligent design theism, God created and guided life's development, maybe via Big Bang; and creationism, projects Big Bang evolution, young Earth.
And atheists often lean towards naturalism.
Many find it the most plausible given the scientific evidence from cosmology and biology and perceived problems with theistic explanations. Modern science offers powerful explanations that don't require divine intervention, unlike in previous eras.
What about the arguments for Big Bang theism, like modern cosmological arguments?
They often rely on principles like everything that begins to exist needs a cause. The universe began, so it needs a cause, identified as God.
But there are objections.
Plenty. Can we infer a supernatural cause? Must the cause have all the traditional divine attributes? Omnipotence, goodness, etc. Maybe only immense power was needed for a Big Bang, not infinite power or perfect goodness. Even if the argument points to a first cause, does it point to the God of, say, Christianity? Many atheists argue no.
And some atheists use cosmology to argue against God.
Yes, though it's often technical. The idea is that an omniscient, omnipotent God would likely create in a more rational, efficient, optimal way than the seemingly messy, random, wasteful process starting with the Big Bang. Sanger, Smith, Everett explored this.
Okay, then teleological arguments, arguments from design. Paley's watchmaker.
The classic argument. Complexity implies design, so nature implies a designer or God. But atheists like Hume, Salmon, and Martin argue the evidence points the other way.
Salmon's Bayesian argument is highlighted.
Yes. Building on Hume, Salmon argues it's actually improbable that an ordered universe like ours was intelligently designed.
How so?
He argues we see order arising from unintelligent processes all the time. While intelligence can produce order, it's not the only source, and maybe not even the most common source on a cosmic scale. Plus, intelligence can also produce disorder. So observing order doesn't strongly imply intelligent design, The probability, Salmon calculates using Bayesian reasoning, is low.
Fascinating. Next, arguments from unbelief. The fact that many people don't believe is itself used as evidence against God.
It's a powerful line of argument. If God exists, especially a loving God who desires a relationship with humanity, why isn't his existence obvious? Why is belief not universal?
An all-powerful God could make his existence clear, presumably.
Exactly. The lack of widespread, clear belief suggests such a God doesn't exist. This is sometimes called the argument from divine hiddenness, framed from the atheist perspective.
What are the typical theistic responses to God's hiddenness?
Things like, God doesn't want forced belief. He wants faith freely given. Hiddenness preserves free will. Believing out of fear wouldn't be genuine.
And the atheist rebuttals.
Well, historical divine revelations didn't necessarily destroy free will. More fundamentally, if a universe with God looks identical to one without God, what does the claim God exists even mean? How could it ever be tested or falsified? And isn't it rational to disbelieve something that defies all attempts at corroboration?
Theodore Drange's argument focuses on God's desire for belief.
Right. If God wanted belief, he could easily achieve it. The fact that he hasn't suggests he either doesn't exist or doesn't desire belief in the way typically claimed.
And J.L. Schellenberg focuses on a loving God.
Yes. A perfectly loving God would surely seek a relationship with every person capable of it and make his presence available. The fact that many sincere seekers experience divine silence suggests such a loving God does not exist.
The parable of the lost child calling for mama
Poignantly illustrates this. A loving parent responds. Schellenberg argues a loving God would too. The widespread experience of non-response is evidence against such a God.
So widespread, reasonable non-belief itself points towards God's non-existence.
That's the core of these arguments. If God existed and wanted relationship belief, the epistemic situation should be different. Sufficient evidence for reasonable belief should be available.
Finally, for inductive arguments, atheist naturalism.
This builds a positive case for atheism based on a broad, naturalistic worldview, the idea that only natural laws and forces operate.
Distinguishing methodological from ontological naturalism?
Crucial distinction. Methodological is just how science works, seeking natural explanations. Ontological is the philosophical stance that only the natural exists. The latter directly conflicts with theism.
And naturalists reject the idea it's just an unproven assumption.
Yes. They point to the historical success of science in replacing supernatural explanations with natural ones, and principles like conservation of energy supporting physical closure. They see ontological naturalism not as dogma, but as a well-supported, empirically grounded, falsifiable hypothesis based on centuries of investigation.
Laplace's famous quote about not needing that hypothesis God.
Exactly. As science explains more, the need to invoke God diminishes. Naturalists also point to specific scientific findings that contradict religious doctrines, efficacy of prayer, age of the earth, evolution, debunked miracles.
So naturalism provides an inductive basis for broad positive atheism, believing no gods exist.
Yes, by analogy. Just as we're justified in disbelieving in fairies or dragons based on investigation, naturalists feel justified in disbelieving in all gods, seeing the supernatural as an explanatory dead end.
Though theists still argue naturalism fails to explain consciousness, morality, etc.
They do. But the source notes this hasn't gained much traction scientifically, and the historical trend favors natural explanations eventually emerging. Plus, atheists are developing naturalistic explanations for religion itself, evolutionary cognitive reasons for its prevalence.
Okay, we've covered deductive and inductive arguments. Now a different angle, cognitivism and non-cognitivism. How does this relate to atheism?
It's about the meaning of religious language itself. It parallels debates in ethics. Are moral statements, claims about facts, cognitivism, or expressions of emotion commands, non-cognitivism?
So atheist non-cognitivism suggests religious statements like God exists aren't actually making factual claims.
Exactly. They're seen more like expressions of feeling, attitudes, commitments, maybe poetic utterances or chants, things that aren't true or false in a factual sense.
So Jesus loves you isn't a claim about a divine being's emotions, but maybe an expression of care or hurt.
That's the non-cognitivist interpretation. They wouldn't say God exists is false. They'd say it's not the kind of statement capable of being true or false. It doesn't assert the existence of an independent entity.
But most atheists are cognitivists.
It seems so, yes. Most atheists, especially positive atheists, treat God exists as a factual claim and argue it's false, using the deductive and inductive arguments we've discussed.
And the source points out that believers themselves often treat their statements as factual.
Right. Religious beliefs clearly function as cognitive claims for many people, impacting their lives in ways that suggest more than just emotional expression. Simply telling believers their core claims lack cognitive content might not be very effective or fully capture the nature of their belief.
Okay, last section. Future perspectives for atheism. What's the outlook?
The main point is that 20th century philosophy, epistemology, philosophy of science, logic, language show that many assumptions underlying both traditional theism and traditional atheism were perhaps too simplistic.
Things aren't as black and white as they once seemed. Certainty is harder to come by.
Pretty much. Our understanding of reason, evidence, proof, even theological language itself has become more nuanced. Bayes, Wittgenstein, Quine, Kripke all contributed to rethinking these foundations.
So the prospect of one single knockdown argument settling the God debate seems slim.
Very slim. That's true for most major philosophical questions, frankly. Belief in unobservable entities isn't usually decided by a single proof. Every argument rests on premises that themselves need justification.
So the reasonableness of atheism depends on its place within a larger worldview.
Exactly. Its adequacy as an explanatory hypothesis depends on the overall coherence, consistency, empirical support, and explanatory power of the entire naturalistic framework of which atheism is typically a part.
It connects to everything: biology, physics, metaphysics, ethics.
Epistemology, philosophy of language, theory of explanation, it's all interconnected. The justification for atheism isn't isolated. It's tied to the overall success of a comprehensive way of understanding reality.
Okay, let's wrap this up. The big takeaway seems to be that atheism isn't monolithic. It's a position reached through diverse arguments, mainly revolving around a perceived lack of evidence for God and various arguments against God's existence.
Yeah, we've touched on definitions, the epistemological grounding, the deductive challenges to God's coherence, and those inductive arguments looking at evil, cosmology, apparent lack of design, and the puzzle of widespread non-belief.
Plus, that alternative non-cognitivist view of religious language.
Right? Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listener. How does your own way of understanding the world, your own approach to explanation and evidence, resonate with or diverge from these perspectives we've explored?
Maybe digging into some of those related philosophical areas, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, could shed even more light on how you view the questions of theism and atheism.
Food for thought.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into atheism. We really hope it's given you a valuable shortcut to understanding this complex and often debated topic.
And hopefully spark some further thinking of your own. Thanks for listening.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel